hey there dorks and or assorted nerds. Welcome to the second installment of a little series where I try to shed some light on a few RPGs I think deserve a little more attention. And just like the last time, the criteria here is almost non-existent. It's just gotta be an RPG I had a really good time with, but doesn't receive the sort of fanfare that I think it should. So things can range from popular, but not popular enough in my opinion, to games people hate, but I love. That's right, just like every other video I make, complete and total subjectivity is the name of the game here. And I'm not gonna lie to you guys, my heart does tend to lean towards the PS1's library of role-playing games first and foremost, but for this one I did try to spread the love a little more evenly. Here's hoping it makes for a more fun watch. Regardless though, I promise you there is some untapped gold in here. And with that in mind, it's about time we jump in. This one's gonna be fun. What's up guys, I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. And to start this bad boy off, why don't we dive into a series that stretches all the way back to the 90s. One that includes so many amazing titles, it's a damn shame most of you have probably only ever heard the name. Arc the Lad got its start on the PS1 as a sort of strategy RPG, but there was this obvious intention for it to go its own way no matter what. On the surface, everything seems to be in order here. You've got a grid layout on the battlefield, characters taking turns to beat the hell out of each other, pretty bog standard stuff all things considered, but when you actually get a controller in your hands, things just kind of work differently than you're used to. Just pushing forward on an enemy will execute an attack, and verticality plays a role in a lot of fights. If I didn't know any better, I would say the first Arc the Lad game was made by someone who had the concept of a Japanese SRPG explained to them secondhand. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. Even in '95, the tenets of strategy or tactical RPGs had already been well established, and it's really nice to take a crack at something that challenges more of that status quo. The story of the first game involves some pretty typical RPG fare, with the chosen hero finding out about his status late into his teens and taking up the mantle to protect the world. It's definitely not going to challenge your preconceived notions of an RPG story, but I found the characters to be more of a draw here anyways. Each of your party members have these loud personalities, and you end up more interested in their comings and goings and less about the main storyline, or at least I did. Like I said though, this is a bit of a dynasty, so there is a second game to contend with, and I'm happy to say it's much more of the same. It has the same approach to combat, general design, and quirky characters, but this time around I was much more interested in that core story, maybe because it continues straight off from where the last one ended. It may not seem like an overly odd concept, but think about it. When was the last time you played a sequel to an RPG that took place right after the last game in the series and had characters return from the original? It's not quite so common. The combat's been honed to a more polished state here, and I really enjoyed seeing returning characters join my party again to help me kick ass. This is an amazing sequel in my mind because it does everything the last game did, but expands on just about everything you may have liked. The next game in the series, however, would take a bit of a different approach. Unlike the second game, which refined the experience players already had in the first entry, Arc the Lad combines that unique approach to gameplay with an emphasis on side content. Players can now, within reason, decide what they want to do and when they want to do it, and there's probably more of that aforementioned side content than actual main story. And speaking of that main story, it is a bit of a departure. It sort of sidesteps the big overarching plot developed in the last two games and focuses on smaller events happening within that same world. After the natural disasters from Part 2, our main character was saved by a hunter, which is essentially this world's answer to combining a bounty hunter with, well, someone who literally will do anything for money. We're talking just shy of prostitution here. After being saved, Alec, whose name I'm just remembering I didn't mention, it's Alec by the way, dreams of becoming a hunter just like his childhood hero and to one day visit the home he can barely remember. A majority of the early story follows this note, and in my opinion, it's the best in the series. Now, I know a lot of you are going to disagree with that, especially Caspasaurus, someone who is historically wrong and, let's face it, offensively Australian.
Here's a fucking concept, right? What if we took half the story from Devil May Cry, but instead of making it about really cool twinks, we made it about racist twinks?
But it is what it is, and I'm always right, so here we are. Which is actually a nice segue into the combat, which I also think is the best developed in the franchise. It looks relatively similar, but with what seems like a smaller scale. If you never really noticed, in the earlier games, the maps where combat took place could be pretty daunting in size, but this time around we have smaller areas that more often than not will fit on a single screen. I won't necessarily say this is an improvement or a downside, but just something worth mentioning. The increased level of player control, giving us the reins to decide what missions to go on and when and where to engage in combat, makes for a more involved experience if you ask me. One that you'll actually feel like you're controlling, which is a feature that isn't exactly necessary for these types of games, but I always appreciate nonetheless. Without a doubt, Arc the Lad 3 is the shining beacon of the series in my mind, and I will admit a lot of that has to do with it just jiving with my character, but there are some other titles to talk about here. Yep, we're going there.
All right. Ready?
If you ask me, this little franchise just did not weather the storm of 3D game development very well. Now, that does sound harsh, and truth be told, it's not entirely warranted. I mean, Arc the Lad Twilight of Spirits is by no means a bad game. It's an effective and unique strategy RPG with some pretty okay looking, colorful graphics. By all means, in a genre that doesn't have a massive backlog of titles to enjoy, this should be a godsend. Sadly though, I have just always judged this game against the previous ATL entries, and it just doesn't hold the same mystique for me. And the biggest reason for that, I don't mind admitting, is its presentation. Like I said, this game is miles away from looking bad. In fact, I really like how much the colors pop, but during this era of game development, we hit what you might call a point of diminishing returns. The amount of money you would have to pay to make a beautifully polished 2D sprite-based video game just pales in comparison to how much it costs to design, animate, and render something that's of lesser quality in 3D, and I think that's the best way I can describe this game. A perfectly functional, enjoyable, good-looking game that just cannot hold a candle to the previous experiences to be had in its little world. Plus, there's just something about an RPG script that does not survive the transition to fully voiced dialogue very well. I mean, honestly, the script is no worse than the games that came before it by my estimation, but something about having these words actually spoken out loud, outside of my own inner reading voice, just doesn't work quite as well. So I certainly wouldn't warn anyone away from playing Twilight of the Spirits. It really is quite good. I just don't think it holds up when compared to the awesomeness that is even the worst title that came before it, which I think perfectly leads us into the entry I like least in this series. Arc the Lad End of Darkness seems pretty damn low effort if you ask me. The eye-catching, colorful presentation from the last PS2 entry has been dropped for a far less saturated look that doesn't really work for this kind of fantasy world, and the 3D models seem to have lost a lot of the style that they had previously. Which, I guess, for some isn't the worst issue to have, but when you combine that with the fact that the devs saw fit to change the established gameplay of the series for this one in favor of a pretty subpar action RPG type of approach, you get one hell of a bad way to end a series. Which is kind of crazy because there are other characters you can play as here, including Elk from Part 2, but these sort of just feel like skin swaps, and there isn't a whole lot here worth really putting time into if you ask me. Really, about the only thing I find interesting about this title is the fact that it was designed around the idea of early PS2 online play with co-op and competitive game modes. I guess this experience may have been improved by having someone else play with you, but I don't know. I'm just not really seeing what the developers were getting at here. And I know some of you are typing up a storm right now after I said this was the last entry in the series. And yes, technically there is a mobile game available on iOS and Android, but hear me out on this one. Mobile games suck and I don't want anything to do with them. Now I certainly could be wrong about that, but let's just say these type of games have burned me before, and I'm not sure something that was designed to keep a salaryman occupied during his morning commute is going to be my game of the year. Which, now that I'm thinking about it, is a really sad way to end this section. But to be honest, it may be very fitting for where the series started, and, where it ended up. I may not exactly have numbers to back up this claim, but I would wager everyone who gets into this genre has played a strategy RPG at least once before. Maybe Shining Force, Final Fantasy Tactics, Legaia. There are a lot of choices in this tiny subcategory and, in my opinion, a relatively disproportionate amount of absolute classics. But for every Tactics Ogre or, I don't know, XCOM, there's a title that slips through the cracks, at least as far as fans of the genre goes, and keep in mind we are talking about percentages of percentages here. Well, I would say Front Mission essentially acts as a physical representation of that concept made real. These games have become cult classics in their own right, but never seemed to rise to a Final Fantasy type of success, which is a damn shame, especially because this may be one of my absolute favorite series of SRPGs ever made.
Thank you.
Starting off with the first title, Front Mission on the Super Famicom did a lot that other games in the genre just flat out were not offering at the time. I mean, sure, mechanized combat was not exactly rare back then, but the amount of customization to be had here was flat out impressive, given the console it was released on might have had a little less processing power than a modern graphing calculator. And before we move forward, I have to at the very least address the elephant in the room. See, back when this game first dropped, we weren't exactly able to enjoy it. Much like nearly everyone else in the West, my first time really digging into Front Mission was preceded by this screen right here. Man, I have said it once and I will certainly say it again, thank the heavens for van translators. The people that do this thankless job made sure my teenage ass didn't have to miss out on must-have gaming experiences as long as I had a working copy of Z-SNES at my disposal. And I am beyond stoked that these fan translators picked this specific title to work on because its story is incredible. It gives off this mature military and government thriller sort of vibe. Imagine if Ghost in the Shell had a baby with the movie A Few Good Men, but one of the good Gundam series like, say, 08 The Mess Team was jerking it in the corner. There's going to be a lot of military-sounding jargon thrown around and a whole slew of four-letter acronyms used, which I really get into. I don't know about you, but I've always had a thing for political thrillers, and as far as that goes, Front Mission delivers something that feels equal parts campy anime and serious government intrigue. I mean, this was all stuff that you would expect from a serious modern release, but it was being delivered by a Super Nintendo cartridge released around the same time as Yoshi's Island. It really puts things into perspective. Moving away from the story, combat's handled in a pretty familiar way, with the grid-like battle map being explorable a few squares at a time, and both close and long-range attack options being available. When you initiate an action, the game switches to this close-up, more detailed view, and man, I remember drooling over how great the sprite art is in these screens. I mean, sure, at the time we had some great-looking animations on the console, but Front Mission was able to animate each limb of these guys, and that's for every single conceivable combination of equipment. I just thought that was so damn cool. Fights in the game are admittedly long, and they're going to test your ability to think on the fly, as well as make sure you get damn good at stocking up beforehand, which brings me to the astonishing level of customization you have over your party of Wanzers. Each of your mechs can be altered to an insane degree. You can control what their legs, arms, chest, and head look like, what they take into battle, and of course what weapons they have on them. And believe me when I say that most of your time with Front Mission is going to be spent looking at this screen right here, and that is not the insult it sounds like. I loved every second of it. I mean, sure, you could just do this on autopilot by buying the most damage-dealing weapon like you would in most RPGs, but things aren't quite so simple on Huffman Island. You may come across a gun that's got higher numbers than the one you have equipped, but you gotta take into account how many shots per turn it can deal, and also how much it'll weigh your walking tank down. The weight stat is going to be your main limiter, which does a great job of ensuring you don't just load out each of your party members with every piece of damage-dealing gear possible. For example, if you're looking to focus on a long-range build, you may have to sacrifice certain short-range defensive options, and vice versa. And once you have these guys equipped just the way you want them, you can change their call sign and their color, and need I remind you, because this does bear repeating, this is all taking place on a Super Famicom cartridge. It really is a crime that it took Square so long to localize this absolute classic, but they did eventually get the job done. If you're looking to play it officially, there's a DS version which sadly censors certain elements. Not exactly ideal, I know. But there's also a remake coming out kind of soon that, if I'm being honest, looks really damn cheap. So if you're looking for my advice on how to best play Front Mission, I would say, I'll get ready to sail the 7 seas of piracy and dust off your favorite SNES emulator, because you have a really damn awesome SRPG to play. Up next, we have Square's apology to the West in the form of Front Mission 3, the first game in the series to actually get itself an official English localization, and a game that blew me away from day one. At the time, I had no idea about the other entries in the series. I just so happened to be in a dentist's waiting room with a PS1 running a demo disc. I saw that Squaresoft logo and immediately knew a quality experience was to be had, which sadly is not an assumption I can make anymore. I may have played maybe 5 minutes of that demo, and I knew right there that I would have this bad boy soon. The story of Front Mission 3 sticks pretty close to the theme started by the first game, and if you ask me, refined a lot of those elements. Just like you would expect from this world, there are government forces at work doing shady stuff involving independent contractors and regular old civilians getting caught up in the drama. Without a doubt, this game oozes that Front Mission approach to storytelling, and it is a must-play in that regard. Combat feels almost exactly like it did in that initial Super Famicom romp, only with a graphical step up and a few cool elements thrown in for good measure. You're still going to be navigating a grid layout and fighting at all distances, and most of this will be going down in urban environments, which I always love. I feel like a Front Mission fan will be able to jump straight into a fight here and know exactly what they're doing, but they'll also find enough little improvements and additions that it won't feel like a rehash. Graphically speaking, this game still wows me today. The goal of the series was always to represent a sort of half-realistic, half-anime stylized look, and this is just the perfect evolution of that idea. Your characters on screen are represented by cute little 2D sprites just like last time, only this title gives us full 3D environments, which lets the game move the camera around in cool cinematic ways. This little flourish does a lot to help fights seem more dynamic and less like a game of chess. When initiating an attack, the game zooms into a similar looking battle screen, but there's this cool transition that almost seamlessly switches your Wanzer sprite out for a 3D model. This being early PS1 3D, you can expect a lot of dithered surfaces, texture warping, and clipping to be present, but if you're like me and you're into old PlayStation games, this is probably going to sound more like a positive than a negative. Stop this video, get off of your ass, and find yourself a copy of this game, because the only way you'll find a better mech-based SRPG experience is by playing its sequel.
Arrow 6, jump!
Arrow 6, jumping.
And speaking of which, Front Mission 4 easily takes my pick as the absolute best entry in this incredible series. Everything these games have strived to achieve, in my opinion, gets perfected here. The story is exactly what you might be looking for coming from any of the previous games, with warring nations trying to keep the peace as shady actors take advantage of that by dealing in illegal weapons, espionage, and coercion. You know, all the fun stuff. This time around, the story takes two paths following two different main characters as they face very different challenges. Elsa is a new addition to a military investigation arm of the EN, and Daryl is a soldier from the USN who's taking advantage of a conflict in South America to smuggle a cache of gold worth millions that his team just so happened to stumble upon. As you probably guessed, these two threads end up running into each other, and the result is one of the most interesting and grounded stories in any RPG I've ever played before. The characters are an absolute joy to interact with, and the institutions and organizations that they get involved with are satisfyingly corrupt. Combat is again exactly like what you're used to for the series, and that means fun as all hell. The jump up in graphics to the PS2 means much better looking 3D models and even more impressive landscapes to duke it out in. There's a new addition here that lets other Wanzers get involved in an attack if it's within range, which sounds like a small thing to throw in, but can really alter how you approach encounters and set up your formations. Just like other entries, there's often more to victory conditions than just beating all the enemies, like preventing a group from calling for backup or keeping a specific target alive, which adds a little spice to your typical SRPG encounter. But to be honest, I think the real draw here is just the overall look of the game. Every little screen, from a dialogue exchange to a fight or even the menus, just look so damn flashy I cannot help but love it. Hell, even the font gives off an appropriately official government document sort of feel. If you ask me, this is without a doubt the best front mission game we Westerners can officially get our hands on, and luckily dirtbag price gougers in the secondhand market haven't artificially increased its price over the years, or at the very least they haven't done it very much. This is an amazing series without a doubt, but if you're looking for the absolute best cream of the crop entry to start in, Part 4 is where the smart money is. But to be honest, you're really not likely to get a hold of any subpar front mission games. Well, maybe we'll save that one for another time. When it comes to interesting and, well, odd role-playing game mechanics, I think the mystery dungeon genre takes the cake. As a kid growing up, I stayed away from these dungeon crawlers for fear of them being too simplistic, and now as an adult, I am trying like hell to make up for that. This odd style of RPG quickly became one of my favorite offshoots from the general JRPG genre, and the catalyst for that change is most definitely Squaresoft's Chocobo Dungeon. I guess all it took to ease me into this new style was a familiar mascot, or a couple of them. But for those of you who aren't too familiar with this type of game, a mystery dungeon title can be summed up very terribly as a turn-based Diablo clone that uses a grid layout for movement. In a mystery dungeon game, everything from taking a single step to using an item is going to eat up a turn, and this takes place in or out of battle. Over the years, there have been more than a few attempts at altering the basics, but for the most part, every one of these games shares a few traits. Each level of a dungeon, with a few exceptions, is going to be randomly generated, and traversing it will include a few sub-mechanics that exist outside of the normal interacting with items and engaging with combat stuff. For example, most of these games have some form of meter limiting exactly how much you can grind, and oftentimes that comes in the form of a hunger or exhaustion mechanic. In a lot of mystery dungeon games, you can regain lost HP just by walking, which, believe me, is a godsend, but as you walk, you also deplete that hunger meter. Once your bar is empty, you can obviously no longer regain HP from walking, but in a lot of games, you also start continuously taking damage. There are items you can use to regain a portion of this bar, but if all else fails, you can often return to some kind of a hub town where you can rest, appraise gear you found in the dungeon, and stock up on the items you burned through while you were down there. Of course, you can find all kinds of twists on that standard if you spend a little bit of time shifting through mystery dungeon games, but Chocobo Dungeon tends to keep things pretty traditional. Most of the footage you'll be seeing here is from the fan translation of the first entry in the series, since it never got an official localization here. But the second game is just as good, if not better in a few minute ways, one of those ways being you can actually purchase it officially in English. The stories for these games always include some kind of a simple setup, and it is always Chocobo's friend Moogle looking for treasure and tripping face first into some kind of a big world-threatening plot. Really though, you're likely not going to be playing these games for their story. I mean, don't get me wrong, it needs to be there, but the real focus is the zen-like experience you can have when exploring hundreds upon hundreds of floors of dungeon. Combat in this game is turn-based, but like I said before, so is movement and everything else. Early on, you'll have to figure out how to maximize the damage you do and minimize how much you end up taking in a scrap, and one really smart way to accomplish that goal is to stop moving when an enemy is around and whiff attacks. These missed hits will eat up a turn each, forcing your enemy to use one of their turns to get close to you, and until monsters start using magic and projectiles, this is a great way to get them to come to you without wasting a critical chance for attack on moving within range. Listen, I know that sounds overly complex, and you're gonna have to trust me, it is much simpler in execution, but after you've played one of these games for like an hour, it's gonna turn into muscle memory and you won't even be aware you're doing it. Once you get inside one of these randomly generated dungeons, there will be a few events that can take place every few floors, like coming across spots where you can mix stuff in your inventory or full-on item shops. And like you would expect, these things are just as random as the dungeons they show up in. I can't explain it, but there is something about these mechanics that just clicks with me on a very deep level. I get this amazing feeling of relaxation just looking at the footage of what can on the surface seem like an overly simplistic gameplay style. It's not for everyone, and it's certainly not the type of genre to get into if things like repetition bother you, but if you're the kind of person who actually looks forward to long grind sessions, I doubt very much any other type of game will give you this much satisfaction. Chocobo Dungeon is great at stringing me along with new weapon or gear pickups, and when I haven't had a few new items introduced in a while, I can always just mix some of my old ones together and get a similar result. There's a magic system to make use of as well, and in the most amazing show of that RPGs are all about numeric stats type of mentality, each spell can be individually leveled based on how much you use them. But besides the sheer mechanical fun of using a fire spell to turn the tides in a tough fight, these things just look amazing. You can also get your hands on one-time use items like mega powerful spells or summons, and these look just as impressive. Sadly, they can be kind of rare, so I'm never able to just use a new summon to see how it looks, but the rare occasion you get to see one of these things play out, it is a real treat. Realistically though, I know not everyone watching this is going to enjoy this kind of game. I mean, RPGs are already a very small subsection of the overall gaming population, and mystery dungeon games make up an even smaller sector within that. Let's put it this way, have you ever called someone a nerd or a dork for getting into role-playing games? Well, people who get into role-playing games call mystery dungeon fans dorks, if that tells you anything. That being said, I think you owe it to yourself to at least try one of these games out. I know from personal experience how unappealing they can look on the surface, but if they can win me over, I'm sure at least some of you will come around as well. Of course, there's always a chance your first instincts were right and you won't get a kick out of this genre, but I think with the potentially hundreds of hours of enjoyment you stand to gain, it might be worth booting up Chocobo Dungeon for an hour or two and seeing if it scratches any itches. It's delightfully charming and incredibly addicting. You might find yourself saying, just a few more levels of this dungeon, I'll finally go to sleep, and the next thing you know, the sun's already coming up. And when I say might, I essentially mean you are nearly guaranteed to have this exact scenario happen to you.
Surely you already know, but this is like turning a broken wheel.
I shall not respond to this.
How many of you guys have one of those games that you pull out when you need to relax? A title that you know like the back of your hand and can play with your eyes closed. You know, the kind you bust out when you want something familiar and reliably enjoyable. For me, there's a few of them. Resident Evil 2, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Mega Man X4, and most importantly, Record of Lodoss War on Sega Dreamcast. This thing is absolutely jam-packed with value from a gameplay standpoint, and that's really saying something because this is not what I would call one of my favorite genres. I mean, don't get me wrong, me and my brother both enjoyed a nice playthrough of Diablo on the Family Compact Presario, and more specifically Diablo 2, but that's not really the kind of genre that comes to mind when I'm searching for something to play. That being said, I am a sucker for 90s era hand-drawn anime and that colorful, unique approach to game design that came with Dreamcast titles, so a lot of planets aligned when I first played this bad boy back in the early 2000s. Before we start, people are going to light my ass up in the comment section if I don't at least mention that this is based off of an anime, but I'd be lying to you if I said I was all too familiar with it. I mean, coming up in the late 90s, of course I saw bits and pieces of the OVA on dubbed tapes, and advertisements were all over the official stuff I rented from the video store, but it's been more than 10 years since I've seen that, so you'll excuse me if I don't say too much about its source material. In Record of Lodoss War on the Dreamcast, you play as some legendary warrior brought back from the dead by Wart. This guy needs you to fight Cardis or Cardis. It's pronounced a few different ways throughout the series, but either way, she's up to no good and he wants you to put an end to it. This game's events take place on a small island outside of anywhere we've actually seen in the anime, and I sort of like that you don't play as anyone in the main cast, although you do get them on your party, which is really damn cool. I mean, say what you want about this game's design or its story, just having Deedlit on your party makes it a must-play for people who love long ears and even longer shoulder pads, which I would assume is at least a portion of you watching. And I can't say too much more about the story because, in all honesty, your main focus is going to be the gameplay here, or at the very least that was the case for me. There are a lot of names thrown around that I'm sure superfans of Record of Lodoss War will recognize, but for me, most of the fan service is sort of wasted. Like I said before, I'm not very knowledgeable with this game's source material, and I would say that's a compliment to how well it plays. I'm a pretty story-driven guy, but even though I didn't know who the hell 50% of these people were, I still was able to get by just fine. You will come across intermittent story interactions, and they are pretty cool, but thanks to the general gameplay hook, these scenes make up an insanely small portion of the time you're going to spend with this game. Most of the time, you'll be scouring absolute behemoth-sized dungeons for loot and enemies, two things this game has in absolute spades. I am not kidding when I say one of the skills you'll need most when playing this thing is the ability to pick your tiny character model out when he's just a few pixels moving around in an ocean of bad guys. Between the enemies, spell effects, and numbers flying across the screen, you'll often die simply because you lost track of your little ginger-headed avatar. Okay, so I normally would explain things in a little more of a deep way here, but basically Diablo rules apply. There's a pretty large world to explore dotted with just a staggering amount of dungeons, and you're going to want to explore each and every one of them to collect EXP, loot, and money. Once you've filled your inventory or you're running low on usables like health potions, keys, or pickaxes, you'll use a return spell to head back to your home base, a goblin fortress you recently conquered by killing nearly everything inside of it. Here you can fill your empty potion bottles, imbue your gear with stat buffing runes, forge new equipment, and get info on where you'll want to go next. You know, this is one of the best kind of RPGs because anything you put on your character actually shows up during gameplay, which can be a blessing or a curse. I eventually got my guy looking like some sort of a cross between a French aristocrat and a Japanese samurai, but who knows how long it's going to be till I find some new armor that has him looking stupid as hell. Your inventory screen is nicely laid out, which is good because you're going to be spending a lot of time here comparing what gear is better than what you've currently got on you and what needs to be broken down for cash. There is a staggering variety of equipment in this game, and despite there being no real class system per se, you can kit your guy out to work in a way that at least comes close to how you want him. What I really liked is that weapons not only have strength stats to consider, but also length and speed, so you might find yourself a killer sword that'll keep enemies pretty far from you, but it may take a week and a half to swing it. Using the aforementioned fusion system, you can forge ancient words into your gear, improving all kinds of stats, and apply cool buffs like extra damage against certain types of enemies or launching fireballs on attack. There is honestly more than enough content here to keep you busy for more than 100 hours, and that's good because holy hell is this game addicting. Sure, you might tell yourself, well, I'll just make it through one more dungeon and then I've got to go to bed, but then you find a new sword that just mows through monsters, and by the time you look up, the sun's already come out. How many times have I mentioned that exact scenario in this video? I feel like I'm selling you guys heroin and not fun role-playing games. And listen, I know that sounds like an exaggeration or something someone would say to hype up a video, but when I first got my hands on Record of Lodoss War, I was in high school in Miami, and that exact scenario happened to me more times than I could count. Consider this a genuine warning. You're gonna have to clear your schedule if you're planning on checking this one out. I really don't know what it is about Record of Lodoss War, but you get lost in a sort of trance with it. You're on this constant forward path where monsters are kicking your ass, but then you level up or find killer gear, and now all of a sudden you're unstoppable. Until you're not anymore, and you want so bad to get back to feeling like a tank that you end up playing for hours and hours at a time, and this cycle just keeps repeating itself. It is so damn addicting, I really can't explain it to you. You never know what to expect. I mean, sure, this chest might open up and reveal some badass weapon that'll level the playing field, or maybe it'll do that plus spawn 30 bad guys in that I have to cut down. And by the way, that is not a hypothetical. It will happen a lot, and when the screen is filled with bad guys, you can take tens of hits successively and not even realize it till your HP value starts shooting down. Record of Lodoss War thrives on making you fight more enemies than you can physically count, and if you don't pay close attention to your life bar and keep your finger hovering near that potion button, you can go from kicking ass comfortably to totally annihilated in a matter of seconds. It is honestly unreal how fast you can die in this game, but what makes it worse or better depending on your perspective is that it can happen when you're at your best. When you've got your most killer gear on and all the badass runes equipped, a mob can spawn in and just wreck you like you were level 1. It's kind of interesting, but you end up playing this like an old first-person shooter. You'll be prioritizing targets, taking out the most dangerous or fast ones first, and you'll also want to make sure you're not standing still trading hits with the horde. Mobility is very important here. There's a little more to it than what you might initially think, but once you get into a groove, this game has a tendency of just melting time away. Hours fly by while you're playing it. It is incredibly fun and, no joke, dangerously addicting. And having said that, for sure give this game a try, even if you're like me and these Diablo-style titles aren't exactly your go-to. I will warn you, it can cost an arm and a leg nowadays on the used market, but let's be serious for a second. Most of you guys aren't playing this stuff on real hardware anyways. I happen to be lucky enough to have a copy myself, but even I'm running it right now off of an ODE, so no one's gonna blame you for getting your hands on an amazingly fun game without donating a kidney to get it. Although that would be a pretty fair trade given how much time you're gonna put into this thing. One of the rules I gave myself when brainstorming for this video was that I didn't want to include a lot of games that never made it to the West, and the reason for that is twofold. First, this is supposed to be a video covering obscure, forgotten, or underrated RPGs, and it feels like I'm cheating if the reason a game fits into one or all of those categories is because the people watching this never had a legitimate chance to play it. I mean, let's face it, with the sheer volume of quality RPGs that never hit English-speaking shores, this series would be like 98% Japan-only games. And finally, the second reason? Well, I've been thinking about putting together a video specifically for fan translations, and I didn't want to dip too far into future Jared's territory. That guy's a fucking asshole. On an honest note though, let me know in the comments if you'd be down for a video like that. Well, anyways, Treasure Hunter G hit Japanese Famicoms in 1996, and those of you that grew up in this generation of games are gonna immediately notice the visual style. In the same vein as games like Mario RPG or Donkey Kong Country, G's in-game sprites weren't drawn by hand, pixel by pixel, but instead each one started as a fully 3D CG render. The team behind the game would then take each one of those renders and essentially screenshot them as a single frame for every animation in every direction, and then bit crush the resulting image so that it could fit into a Super Famicom cart. Very interesting stuff. Now, normally I wouldn't go into stuff like this before talking about gameplay or story, but while rare as hell back in its day, this look is just so damn recognizable, it's hard not to gush about it. I'll link some videos down in the description that'll tell you a little bit more. Definitely recommended watching. And since we're already talking about graphics, this game looks insane. If I didn't know any better, I would have assumed this was released during the tail end of the Super Famicom's lifespan, but it turns out that's not the case. Apparently, the SFC lasted all the way into 2003 in Japan, so there's another random fact to take up room in your brain. Like I said before, this game never made it to US shores, which is actually pretty crazy given it was published by Squaresoft, and while RPGs weren't at the height they would achieve in the late 90s with the PS1, I assumed they were doing well enough to bring over something as big as this. Well, regardless of the reason, a lot of great Squaresoft games never got around to localization, and in this specific case, we really missed out. The story sees two brothers, Red and Blue, very creative naming guys. Anyways, the color boys over here sort of grew up pissed off at their dad. The guy apparently spent most of their childhood preoccupied with treasure hunting, and according to Red, filled their heads with fantastical stories that couldn't possibly be true. Well, after a fateful run-in with an ancient piece of technology and some strange occurrences, the two find out their dad was actually a pretty good guy and sort of right. Turns out he knew about the return of some evil-ass entity known as the Dark Lord. This guy was supposed to be locked away for eternity, but a rogue treasure hunter didn't believe the old stories and went looking for his prison, thinking the whole Dark Lord thing was a story to scare off people looking to get rich off of artifacts. In the process of finding this out, Red and Blue come across a mysterious girl and, well, there's no way to get around this. It's a monkey. I mean, sure, this genre's had animal party members in the past, but this might be the very first case that I'm aware of a controllable monkey in a role-playing game. Very cute. Like you would expect, these troubling times and our two new partners showing up is no mere coincidence, but I won't go too far into spoiling everything here. Treasure Hunter G takes a very lighthearted approach to its story, which I think is a really good thing. There are definitely moments of serious emotion, but really overall, they steer away from the darker and more heavy stuff whenever possible, which given the way the game looks, I think goes in its favor. It's supposed to take a very Grandia approach, with a real emphasis being on exploring a wild and interesting world, and the rest of the game's focus remains on making your main cast of characters really likable, which it does really well. There's a lot of really effective humor here, and in my opinion, it's not the kind that wears on you after a while. But to be totally fair, there is at least a chance that this is due to the people behind this specific fan translation, Obsolete and Metalhawk. Now, of course, there is a chance that that's not the case, but I guess it wouldn't be the first time fan translators or translators in general went in and gave their own take on a joke or their own view of Japanese humor. Regardless though, these guys did a great job of making me enjoy this game because either I really liked their jokes or they did a really good job of bringing across the original ones. One of my absolute favorite moments came after me and my party climbed this big-ass daunting mountain to speak to an ancient magic user at the top, and when we found what we were after, there's a scene I triggered by heading to the very top of the building where Red, Blue, and the monkey decide the coolest thing they could do would be to take a piss off the roof at the highest point any of them have ever been before. They even had their sprites do a cute little shake when they were done. The best part being we got jumped by monsters before Red was able to finish. And using that as a genius level segue, combat in G is pretty damn unique. Kind of like Chrono Trigger, monsters are visible in the environment, which means no random battles. When you run into an enemy, you're taken to a pretty traditional JRPG battle screen, only once you're there, things turn into a sort of light SRPG. You have a grid your characters can move around on, and they use a system I've always really enjoyed in these type of games. Basically, your character starts every turn with a certain amount of action points, and everything you do subtracts from that pool. So you might spend all of your points getting over to an enemy you want to attack, but once you get there and your next turn comes up, you might be able to attack several times in a row since you didn't need to waste any points on moving. It's an awesome little system, and one that does something I don't remember seeing in any other grid-based SRPG before. You have the ability to spin your character around and attack diagonally, so you're not bound by the typical logic of these type of battle engines. Anyone who's put any time into something like FFT or Tactics Ogre knows those coveted 4 tiles around your enemy are your only hope of getting an attack off, but here you can finish off one enemy, use the LRR triggers to turn towards a new one and start attacking them without having to move to a new tile. If you ask me, this was done for 2 very specific reasons. One, this playfield is pretty damn small as far as SRPGs go, meaning strategy would be affected and balance would be a little harder to achieve, but more importantly, I think these guys had awesome CGI renders at every angle and they just wanted to show all of them off. This mechanic, much to my chagrin, even comes into play in the inventory screen. Each character has their own item supply like a Lunar game or maybe Earthbound, and when you want to trade items, you need to select the character who has it, highlight the item, use the trigger to rotate towards the character you want to have it, then select the hand option. To be honest, I love how this works in battles, but man, it makes swapping items tough in the mid-game. At this point in the game, you're going to get your hands on more and more gear, and swapping accessories between different inventories to see who would best benefit from them can be a royal pain in the ass. And I'll tell you right now, people who thought Resident Evil Zero's inventory system was as bad as it can get might want to steer clear of this one. Really though, that's about my only complaint. Treasure Hunter G is an amazingly fun time. It screams that early SNES era of RPG design, but brings a lot of its own style to that formula. So it's got the cool effect of feeling both incredibly nostalgic and brand new at the same time. Plus, it's one of those RPGs. You know the kind, ones like Parasite Eve or Devil Summoner, where fights are so fun to engage in, you go out of your way to keep getting into them. Treasure Hunter G's fan translation is just about as easy to get your hands on as any other SNES ROM, so there's no reason you shouldn't go out and make up for missing out on this one when you were a kid. Besides, this game has what I would call maybe the second or third best protagonist taking a piss scene in any RPG, and as you know, that is incredibly important.
Tage, stay alert. Majin.
Rocky.
If you ask me, Eternal Poison is probably the most fitting title I could have put on this list. Listen, you were talking to someone who loves a good turn-based role-playing game, and as a guy who lived through the three great eras of their existence, that being the SNES, PS1, and PS2 generations, I have played, let's say, a lot of what's out there. That being said, I had absolutely no idea this game existed until I was 29 years old. For a game this far in my wheelhouse to go under my radar for this long is pretty unheard of, especially since it was released during the PS2 era, a period where I was actively collecting these exact type of games. So before we get into this one, let's just take a moment to appreciate how obscure a role-playing game has got to be for me not to notice it.
You, heretic, you'll rain misfortune down upon us all.
Eternal Poison is the story of a kingdom called Valdia, where a demonic realm has sort of just appeared out of nowhere called Besic. This place houses demonic entities called Majin, and they seem to have captured the king's daughter and taken her deep into Besic. The king, being a little upset, offers a reward for her safe return, which brings together a bunch of disparate adventures trying to accomplish the same goal. At the start of the game, you can choose 3 groups, giving you 3 different perspectives to see the story from, but to be honest, I've never even tried the other 2. I always just pick Thage for a new game, and I'm not really sure why. Thage's story has her not caring too much for the princess at all, but more pursuing her own goal in Besic, that being to search for something called the Eternal Poison. Thage has a very disconnected, above-it-all kind of attitude, which I kind of like. She rarely ever gets upset because she feels like everything's beneath her. She talks down to people and disregards any real emotion outside of her own motivations. Not exactly the kind of traits you'd see in a how to write a main character book, but it works for some reason. Not long after entering Besic, Thage comes across a young boy sort of snooping around and immediately ensnares him in some sort of a contract that says he's got to follow her orders or face painful consequences. At first, that seems a little dumb. Like, the idea of this woman just going around and basically enslaving people with magic, not exactly a good look, but we later find out there's a reason behind her immediate interest, and let's just say this white-haired kid is a little more than what he says he is. The story is doled out in a very typical manner for games of this era, that being the visual novel kind of style. Images of your characters accompany word bubbles, and nearly everything is voice acted. It's certainly not my favorite method for storytelling by a long shot, but it's not horrible either. I've always thought this kind of presentation reeks of low budget, and that's definitely still the case for me, but nowadays it's kind of hard to find a JRPG that doesn't do things this way, so either you're used to it already or you never will be. There's a lot of really cool characters here, covering the gamut from a bear that speaks backwards to a Chinese girl who somehow knows she's in a role-playing game. Really though, I'd say the story isn't exactly EP's strong suit. It's not bad or anything, but it's just what I would call bare bones. That being the case, the obvious focus was on the gameplay, and the good news is, it's really fun. But that fun does come with a few conditions you might want to consider. A lot of you guys watching this video are going to be aware of strategy RPGs, that grid-based, tactical take on the typical role-playing gameplay style. But within that SRPG genre, there is a certain subset of titles that focuses on the more unpopular aspects of these games. Alright, so here we go. Eternal Poison is basically a linear grind fest, the type of game you essentially just play to get your character stronger for no other reason than the fact that the next battle is going to be a little easier if you do. In between fights, you can return to a hub town of sorts where you can buy new items, recruit random adventurers who have like-minded goals, and engage in a cool little mechanic that'll let you capture Majin under certain conditions. Basically, each Majin has an overkill HP amount that, if reached, will put them in a state where they can be captured and put in Thage's Librum. So the attack that kills them needs to take away all of their HP, plus a certain portion more for this to take place. Once you've captured a Majin, you can head to a store in town and either grind them up into a skill, sell them, or convert them into a currency that gets spent on summoning a Majin into battle with you. To be honest though, it is not exactly worth trying this out. You can only take so many characters into battle with you, and trust me, you're going to want every helping hand you can get. Swapping out a potentially useful character for a Majin that by design has a very limited skill set is basically asking for a game over in the mid-game. So trust me, you want to stick to making skills and money off of these guys. After you've stocked up on items and divided up your skills, you can head out to the next fight, a process that is pretty damn linear like I said. In a few parts of a few dungeons, you might be able to choose going into one room or another, but that's about all the choice you're going to get in this game. You can't go back and replay previous dungeons, and you can't move between the different dungeons at will. You're basically stuck in a straight line right to the end, and I think that's where my biggest complaint comes in. Because you're on this crash course and you can't go back to redo any of your already completed fights, you can really miss out on a lot of opportunities to better level your fighters. For example, on some maps, overkilling a specific enemy might trigger a really strong Majin to show up, and if you overkill that, it'll net you some seriously useful skills, but depending on how the RNG is feeling that day, you may miss that opportunity forever. So if you just barely win a fight with a lot of your party members dead, you have essentially missed your one and only chance to get them the experience they could have earned in that fight, and trust me, encounters can get hard as hell as the game progresses. To be totally honest though, while very difficult, Eternal Poison is perfectly beatable on a first run. It's just the perfectionist in me would really like a little more choice over when and where I can get into a fight and whether or not I can redo something I royally screwed up. On the plus side though, this game mimics one of my absolute favorite SRPG franchises, Shining Force, with its battle animations. Choosing to attack an enemy in any way will bring you to a cool little screen that'll show that attack playing out in 3D, and I'm not really sure why, but I have always enjoyed this kind of RPG design. This stuff may not be for everyone though, and if that is the case for you, you can turn off these 3D transitions in the menu, but be warned. Because this was the way the game was sort of meant to be played, the devs didn't necessarily feel the need to put any other animations in to replace them. So once they're turned off, you will be looking at the absolute bare minimum graphically in a fight. You might see a flash and maybe a little graphic representing a hit, but it's more simple than what you'd see in a Super Nintendo game. There is, however, a plus side, and it's the obvious idea that the pace of battles are going to get sped up considerably when you do this. Now, for me personally, I have always been willing to suffer through slower elements in an RPG if I get the feeling that it's the intended experience. So, in games with speed up features or the ability to skip summons or magic animations, I will almost never indulge myself. But with Eternal Poison, I turn the animations off here or there depending on the mood I was in, so it's actually really nice to have this option. Of course, it would be a lot better if we had some simple animations when we go that route as opposed to the nearly non-existent ones we get, but sometimes that's the way things go. On the plus side though, if you do keep the animations on, you get the absolute privilege of the game having an opera singer belt out enemy names the first time you encounter them in every single battle you see them. Definitely one of the more interesting features I've come across before. Animations on or off though, this is one awesome little title. Its artwork and graphics remind me of other stylistically interesting RPGs of the era like Stella Deus, or a second example I can't think of right now. I really enjoy its take on this kind of combat style, and once you've wrapped your head around the fact that you should be grinding up your captured Majin for skills and items instead of summoning them, you'll find leveling up to be pretty damn addicting. This might be a game I've only recently found out about, relatively speaking, but I imagine teenage me with his lack of responsibility and overabundance of free time would have had an even better time with it. If you're like me and Eternal Poison just sort of flew under your radar, I would 100% recommend picking it up. I mean, what's the alternative? You want to be playing less RPGs with opera singing in them? I didn't think so.
The church's teachings seem to have taken over your sense of reason since the last time I saw you.
You know, there were so many landmark, high-budget role-playing games on Sony's PS1 that it can be pretty easy to pass up some of the less flashy ones. Essentially, for every FF7 or Parasite Eve, there's like 20 Guardians Crusades. I lucked out pretty hard, and my favorite console of all time was an RPG powerhouse, and because of that, small developers felt comfortable bringing their relatively smaller projects over to the West, and luckily, Legend of Legaia was one such title. Developed by Procyon, a company so small I think this and its sequel are the only titles they actually made before shutting down, Legend of Legaia is deceptively involved. A lot of the time, with low-budget, lower-experienced teams like this, you get a feeling for how little went into a game's production right from the start, but Legaia does a great job of bringing you into a world that feels big and thought out. Legaia is a planet where human beings have long lived in harmony with creatures called Seru. These things on their own look like stone statues, but when touched by a human, the two form a sort of pact. After this, the Seru turns into a sort of wearable accessory that gives the person great power. The world's creation myth explains that this is all because the god who created humans was tired of seeing them almost get wiped out on several occasions, so he gave them a bit of a leg up on nature. The union of humans and Seru went pretty well for both parties for a long time, but eventually a strange mist started creeping across the land, and that caused the Seru to turn into bloodthirsty monsters, and the ones that were attached to humans would bring those humans along for that transformation. So with people running out of options, they fled to remote areas where the mist had yet to touch, and our story starts in one such village. Here we take control of Vaughn, a guy who's recently turned old enough to join a group of people that venture out past the walls that protects the village from the mist in order to hunt. Before his first outing though, the mist, aided by some asshole, breaks through the wall, bringing a bunch of rogue Seru with it. Out of desperation, Vaughn is drawn to a tree at the center of town that tells him about the Raw Seru, basically a type of Seru that can resist the mist and makes its wearer powerful enough to set things right. So after fighting back Stephen King's The Mist, Vaughn sets out to find other Raw Seru so he can put an end to the shitty way things are. He comes across a few party members deemed worthy of carrying these new types of Seru, and that's our basic setup. I'd say the story here is actually a little better than you might expect, coming from an RPG with such little fanfare surrounding it. I mean, of course it has its fans, but this is no giant big-budget RPG on the console. Of course, it's not one of those tales that's gonna leave a lasting emotional mark on you, but instead the kind that feels appropriate for keeping you interested and engaged the whole time you're playing it. What really stood out for me though was the combat mechanics. Not only were these 3D models huge and detailed for the time and the console it was released on, but on top of the eye candy, choosing to attack gives you a very familiar setup if you're a fan of Xenogears. And let's get this straight right from the start, you should be. Attacks are made up of combo-like inputs for each hand, low kicks, and high attacks. The more you level up, the more that can be input here, and that's a cool enough system on its own, but you can actually come across combinations that make for a sort of special move. And you know, I never really figured out exactly how these things are discovered. Sometimes I would come across them randomly when just trying different combos, but other times it seems like a combination I've used a million times would suddenly become a special at a certain level. What I sort of like here is that all of your inputs in battle are built around a menu that takes advantage of the PS1's diamond-like button layout. This seems to be a pretty efficient way to order things versus the traditional list style you see more often in these types of games. That being said, it could use some better organizing. With things laid out the way they are, it takes a pretty long time to get used to navigating these menus real fast. So when you've gotten into your millionth random encounter and you just want to speed through things, it requires a bunch of different directions to be pressed, which can be hard to build up muscle memory for. My only real complaint with the combat though, minus the one I just gave, is that it can take a while to speed up and become satisfying. It seems to me all of this was tuned around having all three party members present, and it can take a little bit for you to build up that roster. So for the two starting chapters that have you just controlling Vaughn or Noah, it's a slow back and forth, and things don't flow very well until you have the whole party there. Once you've got them all there though, it is very fun. I will warn you ahead of time, the encounter rate is a little high. It's definitely not the highest you'd see in the era, but it can still be a bit of a bother for newer RPG fans who are used to far fewer fights per steps taken. Graphically, I feel like this game is punching pretty far above its weight class. I mean, on the world map, they use the typical low-poly, chibi-looking models that I've always loved in RPGs anyways, but in fights, like I said, we've got some really impressive 3D work. The enemies you fight may be a little simplistic and maybe kind of samey looking, but that paves the way for our protagonist to look incredibly detailed. Plus, the little flashes and explosions you get during specials feel sort of arcadey, and that's always awesome to see. In fact, I'd say overall, this is a pretty bright and colorful game in general, which always reminds me of Capcom titles, specifically the Breath of Fire series. Plus, you just gotta love an old RPG that actually has a 3D world map. I know I've harped on about this before, but man does it suck living in a post-explorable world map era of gaming. I mean, come on, these things used to be the best, and nowadays we're lucky if we get a low-budget indie release that uses one. Well, anyways, Legend of Legaia is a great little RPG, and one that I don't think enough people talk about. I mean, sure, the heavy hitters on the console are on an infinite amount of best RPG lists for a reason, but lesser popular titles like this are always great to return to. I think that's because game development back in the PS1 era hadn't hit the insane peaks we see today, so a company without much money could sneak into the industry and drop absolute bangers without having to fund them with what amounts to a medium-sized country's yearly GDP. Honestly, it was better days. Sadly though, a lower budget means less copies released, and that means a much meaner price on the used market. Personally, I don't ever spend $40 to $50 on a single retro game period, so thank God I got this thing at bargain bin prices like 15 years ago. But for those of you that are either willing to throw down a little more cash than I'd be comfortable with, or I guess type the game's name into your favorite torrent tracker, I think you're going to find a really awesome little JRPG. One that, while very well known in the scene, just doesn't get the kind of press I think it deserves.
It's you.
Yes, Roger Bacon. I'm honored that you remember me so well.
Now here we have a very interesting one. Shadow Hearts has quite a few claims to fame in the minds of RPG lovers. First, you've got its story ties to Koudelka, a great little PS1 era kind of survival horror game crossed with a turn-based SRPG. By the way, I talk about Koudelka in a video series I have covering Resident Evil clones, so if you're keen on learning more, check out the link in the upper right-hand corner. And then of course you have its combat system that uses a really interesting gimmick. Every action you take in combat, from attacking an enemy to using a spell or consuming an item, requires you to complete a bit of a timing-based minigame on the aptly named Ring of Judgment. Kind of like how Legend of Dragoon has you inputting timing-based button combos to nail successful attacks, Shadow Hearts requires you to hit the X button in time with certain sections on the ring. As you might expect, better, more accurate hits has you doing more damage, demonstrated here by our main character spin-kicking a dog to death. And failing to hit every mark means, well, you're not going to complete that action. It's a great little mechanic in my opinion. It not only adds a little extra pizzazz to a pretty old style of turn-based combat, but it also jazzes up your more mundane random encounters. From major boss fights to lowly peons for level grinding, you've got to actually be awake when assigning actions here, which sort of negates that lull we can all get into with these types of games where we're just mashing the confirm button with our attention elsewhere until we hear the victory fanfare play. If you're anything like me, the thought of wasting a turn in a role-playing game keeps you up at night, so this is a nice welcome bit of stress in what can sometimes turn into a monotonous cycle. And it's gotta be some kind of important if I've gone this long without even touching on the game's coolest feature, its story. Or, well, maybe not its story, but the setting that story takes place in. I'm sure we're all aware where these games are typically set. It's either some medieval kingdom or a post-apocalypse that's been going on for so long it's essentially indistinguishable from a medieval kingdom. Well, Shadow Hearts, on the other hand, is one of a very select few RPGs set in the early 1900s, and I say that makes for a very cool overall look and feel. And yeah, I mean, it is functionally the same. You're still dealing with your typical RPG stuff like magic, demons, and saving the world from some great threat, but it's all taking place in a world where the radio is one of the most high-tech things imaginable. Outside of that though, I find the writing to be sort of fresh. The general scenario specifically hits me as very unique. There's a lot of mysticism being thrown around, and there's a really cool international conflict sort of vibe with all kinds of small factions from Europe, China, and Japan getting involved in all this nonsense. It's just a really awesome mix of elements you don't see often in the medium. As far as presentation goes, I'd say Shadow Hearts feels like it sits at the lower end of the AAA budget range. A few 3D models look a little simplistic for a PS2 game, and there's a few design elements that are a little undercooked, I'd say. On the plus side though, 2D art is absolutely stellar, with everything looking like it was written on old parchment and dug back up after the fact. I've always sort of enjoyed it when a game has its small visual elements like menus and character art fit in with the overall tone and setting. It just hits a small pleasure center in my brain for some reason. And speaking of things that bring me large amounts of joy, Shadow Hearts makes use of pre-rendered backgrounds, a style that was not all too common on the PS2 and one I am always happy to see. Sadly though, the effect is a bit marred here. I really can't figure out why, but for some reason this game's 480i output really trips up the RetroTink 5X. During screen transitions, you get this weird ghost frame with combing artifacts that can be really annoying, and the pre-rendered backgrounds will seem to bob when the camera pans across them. This was very strange because I've seen the Tink chew up and spit out every other 480i PS2 game I've ever thrown at it, and sadly this is one of the many titles that cannot be forced into 480p via GSM. Well, I guess that's not entirely accurate. You can boot the game in 480p, but it's one of those scenarios that gets messed up in the process. Instead of getting a nice sharp progressive scan image, each vertical pixel gets doubled in height. Here's an example. As you can see, it's not exactly what you would call ideal. And while the game is technically playable like this, I still found that odd ghosting issue during screen transitions, so you're screwed either way. I'm not really sure what's causing this, and I don't remember these kind of issues when playing the game on a CRT, but the good news is, it doesn't exactly ruin the experience. One thing you guys might consider a downside, but I kind of dig, is the fact that a vast majority of the game doesn't have voice acting. At the start, there's a really cool looking cutscene with everyone talking in it, and I was sort of surprised to see that it was part of only a few key areas where you'll actually hear voiced lines. Even though I like it, I will admit that for a PS2 era release, this is a bit of an oddity, but I've always kind of liked the more personal feeling RPG writing can have when your imagination is providing the voiceover. You also have to consider that a mostly silent story avoids the pitfalls all voiced RPGs have, where either the voice acting is so bad you end up rushing through dialogue boxes not to hear it, or conversely, the acting is so good you let dialogue play far after you finished reading the text just to hear the actor finish. Although, if I'm being honest, this does sort of contribute to the slight feeling of a low-budget production I was talking about before. Budget aside though, Shadow Hearts is an amazingly unique title in the world of turn-based JRPGs, and that's really saying a lot for a genre so creative and varied. It offers a feel that is very outside the norm while providing gameplay that is simultaneously comfortably not. What I'm trying to say is Shadow Hearts will deliver that familiar role-playing experience that fans of the category will surely want, but make slight changes to key elements within so that it ends up coming off pretty different, but only to someone who really knows what these games typically offer. Besides all that though, I would say the real selling point here is that there is a section of the game where for 7 agonizing minutes straight, you get to hear the world's most dumb ghost story voiced by someone who is trying very, very hard. Truly, you're never going to hear anything like this again.
Sleep. Sleep. That. Sleep. Sleep. That.
Well, hey there. Thank you guys very much for hanging out today. I hope you get into stuff like this because I have a whole lot of games left that still fall into this category. If this is your first time seeing this series, I'll have the first one linked on screen, and if you like what I do here, support via Patreon, YouTube membership, or a like and comment will most definitely be appreciated. And if you don't or can't do any of those things, I of course will be expecting a 3-page report and no double spacing. You know damn well that's cheating. Alright guys, see you later. Have a good one.